Hi, Andrew from SACS, and welcome to video number 3 in our 12 video sequence on neurodiversity. And in this one, what we'll be talking about is the prevalence of certain forms of neurodiversity in the population across the world. Now, one of the things that we have to be aware of is that some of these numbers that we're seeing, in general, they're reliable, but there are educated guesses in some cases because, of course, people don't always self-disclose about these forms of neurodiversity. There's a question of vulnerability and trust. And also there are variable skills in masking. It's sometimes said that as children grow up with a form of neurodiversity, there's variable capability in being able to kind of hide that from the world. In other words, they may form the view that this is not an entirely favourable thing in the eyes of all the people that they know. And so they find a way of masking this. Well, of course, that can cause the absolute numbers of prevalence to be a little misleading. And diversity is diverse. Well, this is a really interesting question. How severe should a disability be before it's diagnosed? And so, for instance, at one end of the spectrum, let's say autism spectrum, you have people who are unable to communicate. At the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are maybe a little unusual in their focus on certain interests and maybe their social skills aren't great. But when does that become something which would require a diagnosis? That's a question that's dogged the mental health profession forever. So in the light of all of that, view the following slides with caution around prevalence. So let's talk first about dyslexia, and this is the most common form of neurodiversity in the world. So about 10% of the population of the world is estimated to be dyslexic, and in the early days this was called word blindness in the 1800s, and this is where a person has otherwise typical cognitive skills, but maybe they don't read very well or they haven't much of a capacity to recognise numbers. This appears to be particularly heritable, 60 to 70%, and there's a range of different theories which have been proposed on this topic, including visual acuity, but recent neuro research suggests a multifaceted combination of causes. Second form of neurodiversity that we want to talk about is developmental coordination disorder. So that seems to be around about 6% of the world's population. So in its early days, this was sometimes called rather pejoratively clumsy child syndrome. And so then it was called dyspraxia and a range of other things, typically associated with poor coordination, atypical brain structures in the motor control components like the cerebellum. And it can be related to the executive function of the brain. I want to talk about executive function of the brain. Executive function is the capacity to plan something and to get it done in a coordinated and structured kind of a way. Executive function seems to be a really good predictor of certain successes, let's say in a work-life setting or in project management or something of that nature. Now, when you have a deficit in executive function, it may mean that you're plenty smart enough, but you may have a trouble completing certain things. You might tackle them, but you may not have a structured sequence of a way to cause them to be effectively carried out. And that's one of the deficits which can be associated with developmental coordination disorder. And once more, highly heritable with environmental markers such as premature birth and low birth weight. That tends to correlate with developmental coordination disorder. And then we have ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And ADHD is around 5% of the world's population by most estimates. It's actually thought to be higher in the USA. But it has been known since the 1800s, and it's focused on areas like difficulties in concentration, often associated with concerns about behaviour. So the typical trajectory of this form of neurodiversity is where a child runs into difficulties at school. And those difficulties may be associated with concentration, and if the child is not really able to attend to written material, well, perhaps not surprisingly, that can give rise to behavioural issues, such as not concentrating or maybe being distracting of other children or something of that nature. But the point is that this is a disability which can cause difficulties in dealing with academic material. And now through science we know that there are atypical components to the dopaminergic and noradrenergic pathways in executive function, and so executive function comes into this as well, and also deficits in the perception of time. One of the things that we hear from people who have ADHD is that to them, time seems to drag. They feel that everything is taking longer than it actually is. And of course, not surprisingly, that can lead to a sense of impatience, thinking, well, I've been doing this for a very long time, or I've been tolerating this for a very long time, things should move on. Sadly, in earlier days, there was a thought that maybe this was attributable to poor parenting, but once more it seems to be about 70 to 80% heritable. It's often treated with stimulants, which can be surprising to us. I mean, if somebody's hyperactive, why would you give them a stimulant? But it does seem, in many cases, to work. And I guess one of the things that we hear a lot is, why are there so many diagnoses these days? Every dinner party that you go to, people will say, well, my child's been diagnosed, or I know of somebody who was diagnosed. Why? Well, in fact, it seems to be as simple as the fact that for many decades, this was significantly underdiagnosed. And then autism spectrum disorder. So this is about 1 to 2% of the world's population. It's only been known of, in a way, since the 1700s, and it relates sometimes to the theory of mind. Now, the concept of the theory of mind is that people with autism spectrum disorder seem not to be as equipped with theory of mind as people who are neurotypical. Now, theory of mind is thinking about why another person has done a certain thing and having insight into why they've done that thing. Now, this can lead to social challenges. If I don't have a clear theory of mind, I mean, why is this person doing this thing? And it may well be that I don't feel comfortable because I don't understand why this person is doing this thing, especially if there's a rule associated with that. Often you'll see people who are on the autism spectrum like to have really clear rules. You should do this and you should do that. But, neurotypical people don't abide by rules. They'll sometimes abide by feelings, which are very typical of a particular situation, but hard to understand if you don't have that theory of mind. So overactive amygdala is a very common characteristic of autism spectrum disorder. And so what that means is the overactive amygdala means that you tend to get the fight, flight, and freeze response more than you would with a neurotypical person. So the person may act more fearfully or more angrily or withdraw from situations very significantly. It was thought at one stage to be multiple spectra rather than simply one, such as Asperger's rather than autism. Now we know it's really one spectrum mediated by cognitive ability. Now, what do I mean by mediated by cognitive ability? If a person has autism spectrum disorder and they are very high in cognitive ability, then you will have the typical Asperger situation where the person may well be a little bit socially cautious and hesitant, but may be incredibly good at problem solving. On the other hand, if a person is low in cognitive ability, and sadly that can be concomitant with some forms of extreme autism spectrum disorder, then it means that that person is more likely to be non-verbal or struggling with schooling or perhaps struggling with general life tasks. Again, extremely heritable, 80% in most estimates, and challenges in self-regulation and executive function. And finally, sensory defensiveness and the intense world. The intense world effect is where a person with autism spectrum disorder experiences things in a much more intense way than a person who is neurotypical. So I go into a social setting and the multiple voices that I hear are confusing to me, or the lights that we see are more intense. And this does appear to be a characteristic, a genetic characteristic of autism spectrum disorder. So for instance, there is a theory that what's gone on in the formation of ASD is where too many neural pathways remain locked on after a child has gone through a particular developmental stage, at which stage they're supposed to turn off and in effect make the world more digestible for a person. But when a person has the intense world effect, that can lead to sensory defensiveness, and that can be in the form of stimming, what's known as undertaking repetitive activities to try and screen the intense world out, or simple avoidance. I don't want to go into this social situation because there's too much happening. So the next in this sequence is the very obvious questions. What are the strengths in neurodiversity? So we'll be encouraging organisations to consider specifically hiring people with neurodiversities because there's very strong research evidence to suggest that people with neurodivergences can bring particular strengths that are not available in people who are neurotypical. If you find this content helpful, then like and subscribe.